Hi, I'm Father Cliff, pastor at St. Mary's here in St. Augustine's, and I'm here with some special guests and Father Lou. This past week we had had a question from a parent, and it was with regards to the death of the animal girls, so Mariella and Elizabeth, or Busy. And the question was, how do we help our young people to recognize the grief, to address the grief, and to work through the grief? And I didn't have an answer to that, and so we invited people here to talk more about it, and Father Lou is going to share some of his insights from his own ministry, but also his ministry at the hospitals. So how about we just take a minute to introduce ourselves, and then we'll start some of the questions.
Hi, I'm Cindy Masayo, and my experience includes being a grief counselor at hospice, and also the palliative medicine social worker at Cross Hospital. And I'm in private practice now, and one of my specialties is bereavement and loss.
My name is Rebecca Croucher. I'm a parishioner here at St. Mary's, and I've been in private practice for over 25 years, and have had a lot of experience working with adolescents, children, adults, and families around issues of loss and grief. So I'm honored to be here tonight.
And I'm Lou Saliuzzo. I'm in residence at St. Augustine's. I am from Lemoyne originally, and so I do work at Upstate and Krause and community as a chaplain in spiritual care. I began that when I first came up here in 1979 as a novice for the Jesuit order, and I remember telling our director that there was a choice about working in the hospitals, and I said I didn't want to do that because I didn't like hospitals, and I didn't want to be around sick people. I would do anything but that. So I survived that year, got used to the hospitals. I worked for a little bit after that at Calvary Hospital in the South Bronx, the palliative care hospital, and I did CPE programs at what's the name? Columbia Presbyterian. So you know, for someone who didn't want to work in hospitals, I spent a lot of time in hospitals.
But when you started to work in hospitals, one of the things that I noticed when you receive a phone call to go to the hospital middle of the night is that you're engaging with a family or an individual or group of individuals that are experiencing some kind of acute tragedy. Mm-hmm. When you are there with them, what's the first thing that you do?
Well, I stay alone. I identify myself and I sit with them and I listen to them. I ask them, what is the situation? What can you tell me? And I ask them, tell me something about your loved family member or your friend so that I can remember them. Yeah. And so that opens the floodgates. And that's the value of it, really, to get them to own the situation by being articulate about it as much as they can be.
You know, that first step that you take by introducing yourself, sitting with them, listening to them. Rebecca, do you think that's the first thing that we should do when we encounter the tragedy of the accident, with Mariella and Busy, and parents engaging with that news with their children? What's the first thing that they do? Is it similar?
Oh, absolutely. Being present is the number one thing to do with your children, with your spouse, with your neighbors, is be present and be available. Because very often what you're going to hear things, but very often you may not hear, you may observe. You may observe a change in behaviors. So it's noticing, taking notice, being present, paying attention, and then being available and recognizing something different is going on.
So for a parent sitting down saying, what do you feel? Right, to a child?
Absolutely. tell me what you're thinking, tell me how you're feeling. And they may sit there and say, well, what do you mean? You know, because very often they're not comfortable sharing what they're feeling. So it's more about acknowledging how they may be acting, and then saying, well, this is what I'm noticing. And that seems to be different to me. Is there something going on?
In that moment, if a son or daughter said, I don't want to talk about it, how much do you push it as a parent?
That's a really good question.
Lou wrote that question for me, so that's where I got that question.
I'll let Cindy talk on this too.
I think that another main thing that you would have to remember is to allow their grief. And it can come in many other ways, or anyone's grief. We're a society that kind of shies away from open expression of sorrow, and that can be, very detrimental to, children especially, I think, because we model that, and we should model. It's okay, for example, to show your own grief in front of your children. In fact, I would say that would be a really good thing to do, so they have a role model and say, well, this is what grief looks like, and anything, just be open to anything they can say, and you can ask them, after that initial time, if you ever want to talk to me, I'm here for you. And but most I think would listen the first time, I would hope, 9 to 12.
Yeah, modeling behavior is really important, isn't it?
Yes. Very much.
Can you talk to us about that? Like, what as adults should we model? Not just parents, but teachers, priests. What should we model to people so that it's okay to engage that grief?
It's okay to be sad, it's
To
okay.
name it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's okay. I'm very sad about Mary Ella and Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Name them, and just.
During the COVID, isolation affects us all differently. And I've been blessed by having a great friendship with Lou and being able to articulate, I feel depressed. You know what I mean? Being able to say, I'm not myself and I feel sad. But I wasn't always there. You know what I mean? We came from a family that was more stoic. And so if someone was crying, it was a big deal. And it was out of the norm. But I think learning to model it makes it easier for us as people too, right?
Absolutely.
Lou, what do you think?
Well, immediately I react to what you just said, because I grew up in a family where no emotion was left unarticulated in hysterical ways. So
You see,
everything was opera. So
everything for us is silent movies.
But one of the things I've learned is it's so easy to build walls, to distance oneself, to disengage. And I think what's important, and I've learned this in the hospitals, like for instance, when I go into a room and the patient is conscious, I'll find a chair to sit down. So I'm sitting at the bedside, I'm not standing.
Yeah.
It's very
I'm
beloved.
right over,
Mhm.
So you're sending a message that you're not going anywhere.
That's right, that this is important enough that I'm taking time.
And that's good as parents too, right? When parents talk to their
Absolutely. I was thinking about that, as parents, we often get caught up in the busyness of our lives, but if we're recognizing that our children or spouse or friend may be struggling, is to be mindful and intentional about saying, okay, this can wait. I need to be there. I need to be present, and I want to be.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what can happen when that message is naturally sent.
And it's also scary, right?
Oh,
As a parent, if I had said to my dad growing up, I'd like to talk to you about how I'm feeling. He's like, what? What's wrong? So it's I think something that may not happen immediately as parents, but over time, just to know the value of being intentional, deliberate, and mindful, and over time, that other person will become more comfortable.
Absolutely. And a lot when you were talking earlier, is when we're honest with ourselves about how we're feeling, it's part of modeling, it's easier to show that, and then our children will be able to be honest with us. It may not happen initially, especially if it's new for them.
Right.
Like in this scenario, especially, and Cindy can talk about this a little bit more, the 9 to 12-year-old children that are grieving out there, there's certain behaviors and feelings that are being expressed that are unfamiliar to many of them.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about what often happens in that age group? In terms of
Anger, of course, is a big thing.
And it's a mask for something else, right?
Pardon?
Anger is a mask for some other feeling generally.
It can be,
Yeah.
but it can be anger or it can be a mask. I mean, for sadness or just not knowing what to do with your feelings,
Right.
you know, being so angry about that. And, but it can definitely be sadness there too. But, they, at 9 to 12-year-olds, they are quite fascinated by, like magical thinking about death and, they want to know details. And they understand that, that death is forever and real and, you know, they're not there anymore. That's the age when they start thinking that way. Behaviors, well, they could, of course, regress in certain areas, and they won't do their schoolwork, they'll just rebel.
So signs of regression, if they're not dealing with something, what would be kind of not doing schoolwork, maybe kind of removing themselves from activities.
Oh, yeah.
But in today's day and age, what's that look like in COVID? And how does a parent notice that? 'Cause it's
Maybe loss of appetite, or, you know, and not sleeping well, of course, all those things that would, you know, make a parent wonder something's off.
Yeah.
It's not seen in the social part.
And when a parent recognizes that, how do they address it?
Well, go ahead, I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
Well, I was going to say another very common sign, especially, and this is with everyone, but especially with the children right now, is psychosomatic symptoms. Complaints about aches and pains or stomach aches, things that they haven't really had before, but all of a sudden it's there.
They feel
And
it.
so that's kind of a sign that there's fear and anxiety. And so you had asked, what do parents do with that?
Yeah.
Again, it's noticing, especially being able to see this is different, this is,
But validating it, right? So saying,
Oh, yes.
tell me about it.
Right.
Like, if for a really good example would be, okay, talk to me about how you're feeling, the physical symptoms,
Yeah.
for example.
as opposed to me
let's
saying, no,
take
you're not
a
really that
temperature.
sick.
That's
It's
right.
all in your head. That's the
Exactly.
wrong thing to say.
Exactly. So validate it, explore it, be present, and then, you know, even if you have to take them to the doctors and rule it out,
Right.
because then that helps them understand, all right, if it's not this,
Yeah.
then I'm feeling sad, or
Yeah.
you name grief.
You mentioned all those things. You know what? It makes me realize how hard it is being a parent. It's the hardest job in the world, you know, and there's no right or wrong all the time. You know, you try to do the best you can with the skills that you have, and you try to reach out to people that might have a different skill set to help you to explore and exercise that vocation in a way that's healthy. It's a hard job. I can't imagine.
And some,
Go ahead.
and sometimes children will, try to act like they're okay when they're really not, because they don't want to, upset their parents more. They can see they're sad,
Yeah.
so they almost need somebody more neutral to talk to,
Right.
because they know that it would hurt their parents to see them hurting.
What about journaling?
I was just going to talk about that.
So how does that help? And what would a parent say?
You mean encourage them? to
Yeah,
do
so I mean, how does journaling help, and how would a parent encourage that?
Well, if you know what your child's interests are, if you sense that they're a writer, definitely. I know for many others, if they like to draw, encourage the artwork and just talk about, okay, especially for those that aren't talkers and have a hard time, you know, discussing recognize, like with the journaling, you could say, anytime that you may be feeling something, if you're not comfortable coming to talk to me, take this, whether it's in your room, on a school bus, whatever, you need to do, and have it with you. So you could take that thought and put it on paper, because the reality is, and this is for adults too,
Yes.
when our mind starts going and we're thinking, and that could lead to anxiety, lack of sleep, and all that. But if you get it out, and whether it's talking or on paper, it makes a huge difference. So it's definitely.
It's important to not perseverate. It's one of those favorite words.
We're counting, we'll see how many he does.
Yeah, I'm not, it's only been like 3 times I used the word. But one of the things you said last night is that like when our mind does begin to kind of roll or ruminate, that there's a value in doing something, right? So we talked about, Kathy and Manny had this great idea to come up with a scrapbook for the young people in the parish to give to Tom and Maureen in memory of Marielle and Busy. Can you talk about that tangible piece?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Cindy.
Well, yes, people don't always, we all grieve in different ways. I mean, sometimes, there are people that like to talk about it, but if there's a lot of people that just want to do something, especially people that might not know the family as well. And so just a big project like that is just very, it helps everyone. In my neighborhood, there was a tragedy of a young girl dying, and they all got together and built a beautiful playground. And so that was in her memory.
That's great.
And so that's
something everybody could come together for.
Yes, and they came together and they worked on this project, and they were helping each other, as well as helping the family. And it was an honor to their.
That's a great idea. How did that come together? Was it
just an idea sparked that?
Parents that said, how do we channel this grief? But what about the God component? Like, at what point do parents talk about that, or just let it unfold naturally? Because the sad part of this is that not a lot of our families are in church because of the COVID.
Right.
They might participate online. They might watch it on public television, but it's an aspect of their life that might have been more regular, but now it's not. So how do you engage that as a parent?
Well, I wouldn't be preaching about it. I think it's important, you teach by way of example. The kids will associate parents with this idea of God.
So the model.
So, how do they would model a sense of security, that this reality is to be trusted, that the one thing to confront in whatever way you do, it seems to me, is you want to get the idea across that it's not God punishing. This is not punitive. This is, with these 2 little girls, it happened. Indiscriminate chance, perhaps.
Sister
Bernadette
Bernadette,
breaks, maybe. Who knows?
Sister Bernadette said that it was at the convent St. Mary's, and you've heard this before. She said, I do believe that God has a plan, but sometimes God's plan stinks. Because it's this fatalistic understanding, but it's not intentional, and it's okay to get ticked off, right? It's okay to be mad at God and to be verbal about that.
But I think it's important, not just for the kids, but for us adults too, to realize that reality we identify by the word God is trustworthy, no matter what. That's important to realize.
When my dad passed away, and I get emotional talking about it, it's been 8 years, but when he passed away, we spent so much time together, so we lived together, and just one of those things that just, you expect it, but it's hard to accept it, And I remember praying the first 2 weeks, the first month after he passed. I was just so angry. And not that I didn't have enough time with him, but it just felt like it didn't have to happen at that moment, And the advice from my spiritual was exactly that, to be verbal about it, to talk about it. But it was hard. I mean, it's hard to talk to somebody that you're mad at. you know, and that is true with God too.
Right, well, Haven is now in his mid-30s, and he's a kid that I've known since he was born. I held him back in 1985 when he was just months old. I had just come back from California for a summer, and so his parents had him, the first child, and he had a sister, Anthea, became her godfather, baptized her. I confirmed her because she had some health issues, undiagnosed seizure disorder.
Yeah.
And when she was 3 years old, she died. Her mother would slip into her bed in the morning, and before the father, Gus, would get up or things would happen in the family, they'd do girl talk in bed, you know, get started. And so, but when Gail that morning slipped into bed, she found that Anthea had died.
Wow.
And so that was absolutely crushing.
Yeah.
And Haven was maybe 4 years old.
Yeah.
And, the parents were so taken with, and they were involved with Universal Studios, so these celebrities, and so they were taken with that and had to deal with all of that. And most of these adults had no facility, and they showed up, but they were more of a burden than anything else. And I spent time with Haven, just being silly, playing games, giving them the sense that, something has happened, but the world hasn't ended for him. And and trying to keep things as normal and as pedestrian as possible.
Something has happened, but it's not the end of the world.
Right.
Well, you mentioned that there were people that were friends of theirs that were present to them, but they didn't have the capacity to be present to them spiritually or emotionally. That's another big part of this situation, right? We all want, when something happens, it's our natural inclination, not just as a church, but as a community, to be present to people. And I think our first reaction is to try to be physically present, and that's why going to church, all that stuff is really important. But it's hard because it's important for us to be in it for the long haul. And one of the things you mentioned is that Haven's now 30, right? So
35.
you've maintained this friendship with him.
Mm-hmm.
You have been in it for the long haul. How important is that for us as adults? When somebody goes through a situation of grief or tragedy that is unthinkable, for us not to be in it for the moment, but to be committed to be there for the long haul. What's that mean?
It's crucial. Because so much happens at first. Everyone's reaction is, very fast and furious almost as it can be. And then time goes by and grief lasts a very long time, especially when it's a complicated case.
Yeah.
With children suddenly, all of that, it just takes a long time. And when I was doing grief counseling, people would call up for help, like 3 months or to 9 months. 9 months was a big point after the death. So that's quite a long time after, when they're still and feeling isolated.
And so
Maybe
for all
people
of
have
us,
gone away,
that 9-month period is a period that we need to make sure that we're still engaged.
After,
Right?
Yeah.
And is it possible to stay engaged even if you don't know the family, right? So being part of a community.
Yes.
How do we do that? What do you think? How do we stay engaged even if you don't know the family?
I can remember when my mom passed away. That was like 16 years ago, and we were very close. Within the first year, and even after, I would receive, whether it was a card or an email, from people that I didn't know very well, but that said, I'm just thinking of you. Your mother was a wonderful person. And that meant so much to me.
It changes everything, doesn't it?
Yes, so it evokes a lot of wonderful memories, and it gives you a sense of peace.
Yeah.
It brings up the sadness, but the peace, it's everything, because that's what grief is. I mean, there's so many emotions that you feel, And I love something that you said earlier. I feel that grief is truly an ongoing journey throughout the rest of our lives. It doesn't totally ever end, you know? Yes, we can come to, you know, with the 5 stages of grief, the final stage is acceptance, but really now there's another one, like David Kessler talks about, finding meaning as the 6th stage of grief.
Can you talk a little bit about those new 6 stages, or not the 5 stages, but the new one being finding meaning? Because I think it's good for everyone to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely, and we can do this together. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, it sometimes takes a very long time. It does. And it doesn't mean that you're understanding of it. You just find meaning in it.
So the first stage, the 5 stages of grief, which were coined originally by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and then David Kessler joined her, and it begins with denial. And denial is actually the stage, you know, we all might think of denial like, oh, that's not good, but actually it's our survival mechanism when we're dealing with grief. And that's when we kind of go through the sense of numbness and shock and
You can't
disbelief.
Yeah, you can't believe it happened.
Right. And by the way, I just have to say this, in these 5 stages, it's not always 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can go in and out, you know,
Back and forth.
and back and forth.
And it's messy.
And people,
It's messy.
Absolutely.
It's messy. Yeah.
So, go
Can I
ahead.
say one
Yeah,
thing?
go ahead.
When people are in shock, that's usually when a funeral takes place.
Yeah.
Sometimes we had funerals. So people seem to think, oh, they're so strong, they're doing so well.
Yeah.
Well, they're like, it's like robots. It's just, they're just doing things, people are doing things automatically because they're still in shock. So that's another reason it's important to, you know, contact them much later. Don't think they're all okay. No.
So the second.
So the second stage is anger. And anger is when we begin to experience the actual reality. And it's very important to recognize, for people to realize that being angry is okay. It's kind of a sign of, all right, it's almost our protective mechanism of ourself, because really underneath that, when we think about that actual reality, is such a sense of pain and sadness and powerlessness. So it's kind of that, I can't, you know, and often this is when the anger towards God comes out, you know, is in that. So anger's okay, as long as, you know, we hope that at that point people are able to use the tools of talking to others and connecting and finding ways, whether it's journaling or whatever. And then the third stage is bargaining, and that's an interesting one. That's kind of the, well, if I did this, then maybe that. You know, there's a lot of
That's associated with guilt
negotiation.
sometimes too.
I was going to say, and this is where guilt kind of comes in. So there's kind of this negotiation process that takes place in our minds.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like the curve goes like this. And then ironically, as it starts to go up, is when we go into the 4th stage, which is depression.
Okay.
Do you want to talk a little bit about?
Depression is just really a step above, or the stage before acceptance, because it really comes to light that this is really my life, and it's not and this loss really happens. So it's depression is very common.
So accepting the reality leads us to depression, like it's a tunnel, right? And then the other side of the tunnel is what?
It becomes a little bit more. I mean, you're accepting it, you're kind of thinking, oh my goodness, this is really happening, this is my life. Then comes, after that, comes acceptance.
Yeah.
So,
And then the new stage.
finding meaning.
Meaning.
That's the one I meant was not for, it doesn't mean you understand it, because I don't think there's some things in life we'll never understand why, you know, but it just means that you find meaning somehow in it, and it just takes a long time.
This is when memories often, we can take our memories and utilize them and do something with them. So
And that's one of the things that the family asked, that, you know, and let the memory of Mariella and Busy be their life, not the way that they died. And that's hard for us, but I also think it's important for us as people to walk with other people that are grieving to do what they ask us to do, right? So to honor the what they ask, because they're the first ones that grieve, and they're most immediate. So to honor their request, to remember their life and not their death, and that helps them to get through their own grief in some way, right?
Absolutely.
I think we've touched on a lot of different things, but I also know that there's some great resources out there. You know, here at St. Mary's, we have Sister Marcia, who's beginning a bereavement course as well. But can you guys talk about some of the resources that you're familiar with and that we can put on the website, even after? Maybe Lou, you can share some resources that you know about.
Absolutely. Can I just say, one last thing I wanted to add is, given the time, what we're dealing with in our world right now, it's important that we all recognize this grieving process that we all may be dealing with. And so if you at times feel like you're angry and you don't understand why, it's really about the sense of powerlessness that exists around us today. So I think, it's okay, is what I guess I'm trying to say. It's just to recognize that if you have a sad day, allow yourself to have a sad day. And
you corrected me yesterday, which is a great correction about the new norm. We use that expression a lot, but it's probably not the best expression. Tell me why I was wrong again. No, it was great. I used that. It's not the right expression.
Basically, if you think of new normal, when I've asked people, what does that mean to you? What it really does is it invokes this image, this sense of our life as we've known it is no longer. And we have to think of that, and it creates this sense of fear and anxiety and loss again and powerlessness. But that's not true. What's really true is we've had to adapt to some lifestyle changes that we've had to make because of what's going on. But that's okay. So if we think of it in that way, it doesn't feel quite as overwhelming as when you say, we're just assimilating and adjusting to what we have to deal with right now. And hopefully in time, we'll be able to take some of what we've experienced before in our lives and bring it together, right? So, you want to talk about resources? Sorry.
No, it's very good. It's true. But anyway, I would say that the resources for reading and books, we have pages that are going to be up on your website.
We'll put it on St. Mary's and St. Augustine's website.
There are quite a few of those, and it would be hard for me to name a book right now, but for counseling and support groups, the hospice center, the Center of Grief at Hospice is not able to do any groups right now because of COVID, and they usually have a wonderful children's program, hope they will, in the future, but now they just do virtual counseling, which is, kids can do and people can do that too. And for groups though, Hope for Bereaved, they are doing groups, and so we'll put the number, I don't know the number by, offhand, but we'll have that up on the website too. And we're going to be having a support group on grief at the office of our office, and
Right here in Baldwinsville.
right here in Baldwinsville, yeah, in the village, and that will be starting October 20th.
Great.
So,
Do you have any resources that you want to share?
Well, I'm on the staff at the Spiritual Renewal Center in town, so in the Westcott district, and we've had some programs that address the phenomenon of grief and loss. So, and another resource I would and allow people to go to it in whatever way they want to. But in the Christian tradition, the Gospels of the Easter, so-called Easter season, and the misappropriation of that is, so the tomb is empty, and so we'll spend 50 days celebrating and getting on to life as usual. And some people, scripture scholars, or looking at those Gospels and suggesting that this is a community. Forget the idea that they just needed 2.5 days to get over the trauma. they never got over the trauma, because that was the impetus for their commitment to build something new. And so for that time that we call the Easter season, to look at those Gospels, they fit in with these the dynamics of grief. What this community had to go through to get to a point where they could see the possibilities of the future. You know, not dismissed from what they lost, but to see that it's an integration, that the loss really is opening up new doors, a future for them.
It's a process.
It's a process, and in the Jewish tradition, all you need to do is to go to the book of Job to see this process.
That's true. So we'll have the information about the resources on the website, both at St. Mary's and St. Augustine's. And again, just to give a plug to Sister Marcia, who's starting a group here, but also the group that's starting on October 20th here in Baltimore as well. And at St. Augustine's, we have Catholic Charities that offers counseling as well. We're really grateful that you took the time to be here, and Lou, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your emotion experience. And maybe we could end with a prayer.
That would be wonderful.
Go ahead.
I'll start. Dear God. Go ahead.
Good and gracious God, source of our lives, teach us to reverence life in all of its forms. Teach us to embrace all that life offers, whether we suspect grace or not, and know that even in traumatic experiences, we find you there, encouraging and standing with us. We pray to you because we trust you. Amen.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.